They say every secret has a price. Tonight, I'm paying mine. I'm watching fire turn my home into a funeral pyre. Through the roar, I can hear the howl of my friend, the Dogman, trapped in the cellar below, and I swear I can smell it, the sickening sweet scent of his burning flesh. I was supposed to protect him. I swore I would. But fate is just a pretty word for failure. This isn't a tragedy. It's my sin. And now you're going to hear exactly how I earned it. The smell of coffee, grounds, and damp pine is how I know a day is beginning. At 73, my mornings are a ritual of quiet predictability. My wife, Helen, moves through the kitchen with a soft efficiency that has been the background music to my life for 50 years. Our house sits nestled in the foothills of the Cascade Mountains, a newer, more sensible home than the one I grew up in. But the Oregon air is the same. It carries the scent of cedar and the promise of rain. I look out the window at the mist clinging to the Douglas firs, and for a moment, everything is perfectly still. It's in these moments of peace that the memory always returns, not as a gentle echo, but as a fracture. I see our old farmhouse, my father whistling as he sharpens a plane in the workshop, my mother humming over a pie, a perfect sun-drenched photograph of a life that never truly existed, because that piece was a lie, built over a secret buried in the earth. The weight of it has settled in my bones, a deeper ache than the arthritis in my knuckles. Helen will sometimes touch my arm as she passes, her skin soft and familiar, and I will force a smile. But the connection feels thin, like a wire stretched across a canyon. She has lived her whole life with a ghost in her marriage, and has been kind enough to never name it. For 50 years, I have given her a version of myself, a carefully edited man who keeps the most vital parts of his history locked away. The real me, the 17-year-old boy who made an impossible choice, is still trapped in the autumn of 1967. That was a different world. The air itself felt younger, charged with a naive energy that has long since bled out of the century. I was all sharp angles and restless energy, convinced that the boundaries of our farm were the boundaries of the known universe. The forest that pressed in on all sides was just the woods, a place of deer and coyotes and the occasional black bear. It was a known quantity, a thing to be respected but not feared. My father had taught me how to read its signs, how to walk without sound, how to know which way the wind was blowing. He had taught me the rules. But the forest had secrets older than any rules my father could teach, and that day it decided to share one with me. The air was heavy with the smell of decay, that sweet, earthy scent of a forest turning in on itself for the winter. I was walking the northern fence line, my boots sinking into the soft mulch of fallen leaves, my mind on anything but the task at hand. And then I heard it. It was not the cry of a cougar or the panicked squeal of a rabbit. It was a sound that violated the very air it travelled on, a sound that the trees themselves seemed to recoil from. It was a sound of splintering bone and a scream that tried to turn into a growl, but broke halfway through. I was 17, and the foolishness of that age is a kind of armour against common sense. The sound had frozen me in place for only a moment before that armour took hold, pushing aside the cold knot of fear in my stomach with a stupid, reckless curiosity. I left the fence line, a line that had always represented safety and order, and pushed deeper into the trees. The undergrowth was thick, wild rhododendron and mountain laurel creating walls of green that blocked out most of the autumn light, casting the forest floor in a perpetual twilight. The air grew still. the normal chatter of birds and squirrels silenced by that single, unnatural cry. I pushed through for what felt like an eternity but was likely only 20 minutes before I found him. He was lying in a small clearing, partially hidden under the branches of a fallen oak tree. My legs just stopped working. I could not move, could not breathe, could not process what I was seeing, because what was bleeding out in front of me should not have existed. He looked like something out of a nightmare, but worse because it was real and it was suffering. His body was humanoid, maybe 7 feet tall, muscular in a way that made our farm's strongest workhorses look weak. But his head was wrong, so terribly wrong. It was canine, like a timber wolf or maybe a German shepherd, but larger and more expressive. Dark fur covered most of his body, thick and matted with blood and dirt. His hands, and they were hands, not paws, had long fingers with claws at the ends, currently digging into the soft earth as waves of pain consumed him. The injury was bad. His right leg had been caught in what looked like a bear trap, one of those illegal ones with rusted teeth that hunters sometimes set deep in the woods and forgot about. The metal had bitten deep through fur and muscle, and I could see the glint of white bone. Infection had already set in, the flesh around the wounds swollen and discoloured, leaking a foul-smelling fluid. What stopped me from running was not just the shock of seeing him. It was his eyes. When he noticed me standing there, frozen like a post, he looked at me with eyes that were completely, terrifyingly human. They were brown and intelligent and filled with a pain so profound it felt ancient. But there was something else there, too. Resignation, as if he had been waiting to die, and I was simply the final, inevitable threat. We stared at each other for what felt like hours, but was probably only 30 seconds. I could see his chest heaving with rapid, shallow breaths. I could smell the infection and the blood and something wild, like wet dog, but more complex, more alive. And in that silence, I made a choice that would define the rest of my life. I should have run. I should have gone back to the house and gotten my father and his rifle. That would have been the smart thing, the safe thing. But I could not. Those eyes held me there, and in their depths I saw not a monster, but a person in agony. That night, under the cloak of a moonless sky, I began the impossible task of moving him. He was heavy, probably 300 pounds of solid muscle and bone, and could barely move on his own. I had to essentially drag him through the woods, stopping every few minutes when the pain became too much for him to bear. It took us almost 4 hours to cover the 1 mile back to the farm. 4 hours of struggling through undergrowth, across streams, over fallen logs. 4 hours of him making sounds that varied between growls of determination and whimpers of agony. 4 hours of me talking to him constantly, my voice a low, shaking whisper, as if my words alone were the only thing keeping him conscious. We reached the edge of our property just before dawn. I left him hidden in the tree line and ran ahead to the old smokehouse. Beneath it was a root cellar, a place no one had used in a decade, its heavy wooden doors nearly swallowed by overgrown weeds. It was damp and smelled of earth and forgotten things. But it was hidden. It was safe. Getting him down those steep stone steps almost killed us both. But finally, he collapsed onto the dirt floor. I closed the heavy doors, plunging us into absolute darkness, and for the first time, the full weight of what I had done crashed down on me. I had brought the impossible home, the first link of a chain I would spend the rest of my life forging. A storm rolled in that night, a proper Oregon deluge that hammered against the cellar doors, a sound like fists against the world. Down in the dark, it was a comfort, a thick blanket of noise that sealed us in our own subterranean world, masking the sounds from within. The darkness was absolute, a physical presence that smelled of damp earth and rotting apples. I fumbled back up the stairs, my heart a frantic drum against my ribs, and ran to the workshop to grab an old kerosene lantern and a book of matches. When I returned and struck a match, the sudden flare of light was violent. It threw our shadows, huge and distorted, against the cold stone walls, and it revealed him, fully, for the first time. He was huddled against the far wall, the mangled legs stretched out before him, the raw metal of the trap still clinging to the wound like some obscene parasite. His eyes, catching the lamplight, glowed with a feral, golden intensity, but they were fixed on me with an unnerving intelligence. The space was tight, no more than 10 feet by 10 feet. To work on him, I had to get close, my knees brushing against his fur as I knelt in the dirt. His body radiated an unnatural heat, a fever that I could feel through the thick denim of my jeans, a dry, baking heat that spoke of a battle being waged within his blood. The fur, where it was not matted with filth, was coarse, like wire. The smell was overwhelming, a thick, sweet poison of infection that clung to the back of my throat, mixed with the wild, musky scent of a creature that had never known 4 walls. I had to get the trap off. I had brought a tire iron from the truck, and using it as a lever, I began to pry at the rusted jaws. He made no sound, but I could feel the tremors that racked his body, the tightening of every muscle as I worked. The metal groaned in protest, a sound that grated on my nerves. With a final, sickening screech, the jaws sprang open. He let out a low growl, a sound of pure agony that vibrated through the very floor, and I saw his hand clench, the claws digging deep furrows in the packed earth. Now came the harder part. The wound was a mess, a torn landscape of flesh and shattered bone. I had brought a bucket of water from the well and a bar of lye soap from the house, along with a bottle of iodine and some clean rags from my mother's sewing basket. As I began to clean the wound, gently at first, he watched my every move. His stillness was more terrifying than any aggression would have been. He was enduring it, allowing it. I had to cut away the matted fur around the edges, and as the scissors snipped close to his skin, I could feel the heat intensify. I poured the iodine into the wound. It was a cruel act, a necessary fire to fight the greater fire of infection. A guttural cry of agony tore from his throat, a sound that the storm outside thankfully swallowed. In that instant, his massive hand shot out and clamped around my wrist. I froze, my heart seizing in my chest, the bucket clattering to the floor. The strength was incredible, a vice of muscle and bone. I could feel the sharp points of his claws pressing into my skin, a promise of the damage they could inflict in a single, reflexive clench. This was it. The moment the animal overcame the man, the moment my foolish compassion earned me my death. But it did not happen. The claws dug into my flesh, but they did not break it. The pressure was immense, a crushing weight, but it was controlled. I looked from his hand on my wrist to his face. His eyes were squeezed shut, his muzzle wrinkled in a silent scream of pain. But he was holding on, not lashing out. I could feel the frantic, powerful pulse in his veins, a life hammering against my own. He was trusting me, even as I caused him unimaginable pain. The predator was allowing the prey to tend to its wound. In that moment, he became more than a creature. He became a responsibility. He became Silas. When the spasm passed, his grip loosened, and his hand fell away. I took a ragged breath and went back to work, my own hands shaking. But I knew then that soap and iodine would not be enough. The infection was too deep, the red lines of it already creeping up his leg. He needed medicine, real medicine. Later that night, long after the house had fallen silent, I crept from my room. The floorboards of our old farmhouse, which I had known my entire life, suddenly seemed like enemy agents, ready to betray me with every creak. I slipped into the bathroom, the air smelling of my father's shaving soap and my mother's floral powder. I opened the medicine cabinet. My reflection in the mirror was a stranger, a pale, wide-eyed ghost. There, on the top shelf, was the bottle of powerful antibiotics left over from my sister's bout with pneumonia months earlier. My hand trembled as I took them. This was a different kind of line to cross. Helping a creature in the woods was one thing. Stealing from my family, lying to them, was another. This was the first deception, the first secret that would begin to build a wall between their world and mine. I took the bottle and slipped back into the night, the small, precious pills rattling softly in my pocket, a sound that marked the true beginning of my double life. Years passed. The secret grew roots, twisting itself into the foundations of my life, a dark and vital thing that drew its sustenance from my silence. By the time I was 40, in the autumn of 1990, the lie had become so intertwined with the truth that I no longer knew where one ended and the other began. I was sitting at the head of a Thanksgiving table, the golden light from the chandelier glinting off the polished silverware. The room was warm, bright, filled with the murmur of familiar voices and the rich smells of roasted turkey and cinnamon. My wife, Helen, was laughing, a sound that had once been the cornerstone of my world, but now seemed to come from a great distance. Her brother was telling a loud, pointless story about fishing. My son, Daniel, a teenager then with a permanent storm cloud on his brow, was complaining about having to eat turkey. It was a perfect picture of a life, the kind of scene people strive for. But I felt a suffocating coldness, an internal winter that the warmth of the room could not touch. I raised a forkful of stuffing to my lips, and the food tasted like sawdust, a dry, meaningless texture in my mouth. My senses were lying to me, or perhaps they were telling me a deeper truth. I could smell the phantom scents on my hands, scents that no amount of soap could ever wash away. Underneath the aroma of sage and melting butter, I could smell the faint, metallic tang of the raw deer meat I had brought Silas the night before. I could smell the low, persistent odor of damp earth and something wilder, the musk of a life lived in darkness. For 23 years, that cellar had been the center of my universe. It had expanded, not just in physical space. We had dug out new rooms, reinforced the walls, even run a hidden electrical line from the workshop. But in my soul, it was a secret kingdom, and I was its sole citizen and guardian. The conversations washing over me at the table were a foreign language. They spoke of mortgages and school sports and the price of lumber. They were the concerns of a world that operated on a set of rules I only pretended to follow. Down below, in the quiet dark, communication with Silas was a language of its own, built of gestures, of shared silence, of a guttural vocabulary that held more meaning for me than any of the empty words being spoken in this bright, warm room. He was pure in his wildness, honest in his needs. There was no artifice in him. His pain was real. His gratitude was real. His rare moments of contentment were a powerful, silent force. These people, my people, were a labyrinth of unspoken resentments and polite fictions. I could see the flicker of annoyance in Helen's eyes as her brother droned on. I could feel the teenage angst radiating from Daniel, a frustration with a world he felt did not understand him. We were all wearing masks, playing our designated roles. Helen reached over and placed her hand on my shoulder, a gesture of casual affection, a silent question asking why I was so quiet. I flinched. It was a small, involuntary movement, but it felt like a betrayal. Her touch, so familiar and once so comforting, felt alien. It was too soft, too fragile, impossibly human. My skin, my nerves, were accustomed to a different reality, to the rough texture of Silas's fur when I changed a bandage, to the solid, powerful weight of his presence in the dark. A wave of profound and terrible clarity washed over me, so sharp and cold it stole my breath. I felt more honest, more real, in the silent, dark space beneath the ground with Silas than I did here, in the light, with my own family. He had never lied to me. He had never pretended to be anything other than what he was. He was a creature of instinct and intelligence, of profound loneliness and unwavering loyalty. He had become the anchor of my life, and this world, the one with the mortgage and the Thanksgiving turkey, was the phantom. The thought was a venomous spike in my soul, a cold, hard truth that settled in my gut like a stone. I was more loyal to the monster in my cellar than to the family at my table. I was a stranger in my own home, a ghost at my own feast, and in that moment, looking at the faces of the people I was supposed to love, I felt an isolation so complete, it was like drowning. The secret was a living thing, and it needed to be fed. It fed on my time, my energy, my peace of mind. But as the years wore on, I knew it would eventually need to feed on someone else. It was too heavy for one man to carry into old age, and the thought of it dying with me, of Silas being left alone, was a terror that visited me in the deep hours of the night. I told my son, Daniel, in the spring of 1991, the year he turned 16. He was at that age of restless rebellion, a coiled spring of defiance and certainty. I drove him out to the old farm, which by then was used for little more than storage and my own private solitude. He was sullen, assuming this was to be another lecture about his grades or his attitude. We stood in the smokehouse, the air thick with the smell of sawdust and old grease. I did not try to explain or soften the blow. I simply told him there was something he needed to see, something he needed to understand about his father, about our family. I pulled open the hidden trap-door. He scoffed at the theatrics of it, but when the air rose from the darkness, that same ancient, earthy, musky smell, the smirk on his face faltered. His reaction when he saw Silas was not what I had expected. He did not scream or run. He just stared, his face draining of all colour, his teenage bravado crumbling into a fine dust. He took a staggering step back, his hand gripping the ladder as if it were the only solid thing in the universe. But in his eyes I saw not just fear, but a flicker of something else, a horrified, grudging understanding. This was the answer to all the unspoken questions of his childhood. My long absences, my secrecy, the deep, unplaceable sadness he must have always sensed in me. It took time, months, for him to process it, but he did. The secret settled into him, and over the next few decades, he became my partner. He was the one who could carry the 50-pound bags of feed when my back gave out, the one who could make the late-night runs for supplies without raising suspicion. The secret became a silent, unbreakable bond between us, and I watched with a mixture of pride and profound guilt as the weight of it shaped him into a more serious, more somber man than he should have been. And then, just last year, it was time for my grandson, Jacob. He was 10, a quiet boy with wide, serious eyes that seemed to see more than he let on. My hands had grown stiff with arthritis, and the descent down the ladder had become a treacherous, painful ordeal. Daniel was now 51, and the responsibility we shared was beginning to wear on him as well. The lineage had to continue. It was a grim necessity. The three of us drove to the old farm on a grey Saturday afternoon. Daniel was silent, his hands tight on the steering wheel. Jacob sat in the back, tracing patterns on the fogged-up window, sensing the tension but not understanding its source. In the smokehouse, which now served as my private workshop, the air was still. I looked at Daniel, and in his face I saw the mask of grim acceptance he had worn for 32 years. He nodded, a barely perceptible motion. I took Jacob's small, warm hand in my own, my skin like dry parchment against his. "There's a family secret down here, Jacob," I said, my voice hoarse. "It's the most important secret there is." I pulled open the trap door. The air that rose from the darkness was the same as it had always been. Earth, musk, and something ancient. Jacob's hand tightened in mine as he peered into the blackness. He was a child of stories, of movies and video games. He was expecting a monster. I knew it. He was expecting a slavering beast from a nightmare. We descended the ladder, me first, my joints screaming in protest, then Jacob, his small sneakers finding the rungs with a nervous uncertainty. Daniel followed, closing the door behind us and plunging the space into a familiar gloom, broken only by the single, bare bulb that hung from a wire. Silas was waiting. He had known we were coming. He was old now, as old in his years as I was in mine. The thick, dark fur of his youth was shot through with silver, especially around his muzzle and his great, intelligent eyes. He sat quietly on the simple cot we had built for him decades ago. His massive frame stooped with age. He was no longer a terrifying force of nature I had found in the woods. He was an elder, a prisoner, a king in a kingdom of stone and shadows. Jacob stopped at the bottom of the ladder, his small body rigid, his eyes widened, but he made no sound. He was taking in the impossible sight before him. The size of the creature, the clawed hands resting on his knees, the slow, rhythmic rise and fall of his chest. Silas looked at the boy, and his gaze was not threatening, but filled with a deep, weary curiosity. Then, with a slowness that spoke of ancient joints, he moved. He reached out a gnarled, clawed hand, not to threaten, not to frighten, but to offer something. In his palm rested a small object. It was a crudely carved wooden bird, its wings outstretched as if in mid-flight. Its surface was worn smooth, polished by decades of handling in the dark. It was a thing of impossible delicacy to have been crafted by such powerful, dangerous hands. "Go on," I whispered. "He made it for you." Jacob took a hesitant step forward, then another. He reached out a trembling hand and took the bird, his small fingers wrapped around the smooth wood. He looked from the bird to Silas's ancient, patient face. I watched my grandson's expression, and what I saw broke my heart. It was not fear. The initial shock was already fading, replaced by something far heavier. It was a dawning, terrible understanding. His gaze shifted from Silas to his father's grim face, then to my own weary one. In that moment, in the dim light of that cellar, he saw the chain. He saw the secret not as a wonder, but as a weight. He understood, with the devastating clarity of a child confronted with an adult truth, that this was not a gift, it was a sentence. He was now a keeper, a jailer. He was the next link. His childhood, the simple, uncomplicated world of a 10-year-old boy, had just ended in a dark hole in the ground. The end came not with government agents or flashing lights, not with a slip of the tongue or a moment of carelessness, but with the smell of smoke. The summer of 2023 was the driest on record, a long, brutal season that had baked the moisture from the earth and left the forests standing like a vast field of tinder. The sky had been a hazy, oppressive yellow for weeks, and the sun was a pale, impotent disk behind a veil of distant haze. We had grown accustomed to the taste of ash in the air, the fine, grey powder that settled on every surface. But this was different. This was close. It started as a subtle shift in the wind, a new, acrid note in the familiar scent of pine and dust. Then came the sirens, a faint, mournful wail that grew steadily closer, a sound that spoke of a beast unchained and moving our way. Evacuation orders crackled over the small battery-powered radio, a calm, disembodied voice listing road closures and townships that were now just names in the path of a monster. The world outside our windows began to shrink. Helen, my Helen of 50 years, was a blur of frantic, purposeful motion, her hands, usually so steady, now trembling as she pulled photo albums from the shelves and stuffed them into a cardboard box. She was saving our life, the documented one, the one of pictures of smiling children and family holidays. Daniel, my son, was throwing supplies into the back of his truck with a grim efficiency. Water, blankets, the emergency kit. He was saving our lives, the physical ones. And Jacob, my grandson, stood in the doorway, his small face pale, his wide, serious eyes fixed on me, looking for an anchor in a world that was coming undone. I could offer him nothing. I stood on the porch of our new house, a house I had never truly considered home, and watched the horizon burn. It was not just a glow anymore. It was a pulsing, malevolent light, a false dawn consuming the afternoon. The roar of it was a low, constant thing you felt in your bones, a sound like a freight train that never passed. My body was frozen, a useless statue of old flesh and bone. My mind, however, was racing, caught in a frantic, hopeless calculus of miles and minutes. The old farm was 12 miles from here, directly in the path of the fire. 12 miles of winding country roads that would now be clogged with panicked people, or blocked entirely. Daniel came and stood beside me, the heat from the approaching fire already hot on our faces. He was covered in a fine layer of soot, his eyes red-rimmed and exhausted. He did not have to ask the question. It was a question we had been silently asking each other for over 30 years. It was in the way his jaw was clenched, in the desperate, pleading helplessness in his eyes. He looked at me, the son looking to the father for an impossible solution, for a miracle to undo a lifetime of impossible choices. I watched a shower of embers, like a swarm of fiery insects, drift over the nearby ridge. I could feel the heat on my eyelids. "Weaken not," I whispered, and the words tasted like ash. They were the two most difficult words I have ever spoken, a final, brutal betrayal that dwarfed all the small deceptions of the past 5.5 decades. He did not argue. He knew. He had run the same impossible numbers in his own head. The fire was crowning through the treetops now, moving faster than a man could run. The sheriff's department had already closed the old county highway. There was no way in, and even if there were, there would be no way out. There was no time. There was no time to drive there, no time to open the cellar, no time to coax an old, stiff-limbed creature up a narrow ladder, no time to get him into a truck he would have fought, no time to escape the wall of flame that was already descending upon us. There had been 56 years, and now there were no minutes left. He simply nodded, a single, sharp movement of his head, and a terrible, silent understanding passed between us. A lifetime of shared duty had come to this, a shared, soul-crushing failure. He turned and walked back into the house to get his mother and his son. The drive away was a silent, waking nightmare. Helen was weeping softly in the passenger seat, her hands clutching a framed photograph of our wedding. Jacob was in the back, his face pressed against the rear window, watching his world disappear. Daniel drove with both hands locked on the wheel, his knuckles white, his eyes fixed on the road ahead, as if he could outrun the ghosts that were chasing us. I looked in the rearview mirror. I watched the familiar, rolling hills of my youth, the landscape that was as much a part of me as my own blood and bone, disappear behind a wall of roiling orange flame. And then I saw it, a plume of black smoke, darker and thicker than the rest, rising from the direction of the old farmstead. It was the smoke of our history, of the barn my grandfather had built, of the house where I was born. It was the smoke of the workshop and the smokehouse and the cellar buried deep in the earth beneath it. I closed my eyes, but the image was burned onto the inside of my lids. I saw the fire consume the workshop, the floorboards turning to glowing embers and collapsing inward. I saw the heavy trapdoor, the guardian of our secret for so long, splintering and giving way, filling the space below with a cascade of fire and smoke. I forced myself to imagine his final moments, the confusion, the smell of the smoke seeping down, the rising heat, the terror, the realization that the walls that had been his sanctuary for his entire life had become the walls of a kiln. The air, already thin and musty, would have grown thick and unbreathable, turning to poison long before the heat reached him. After 56 years of hiding, of secrets and lies, of a life lived in two separate worlds, the secret was finally safe. Not because we had kept it, but because nature, in its terrible, indiscriminate power, had erased it. The world was safe from him, and he was finally safe from the world. I opened my eyes and looked at my own trembling, useless hands. The boy of 17 had made a promise to a dying creature in the woods. The old man of 73 had broken it. I had not saved a friend. I had only built him a tomb, and then stood by and watched it burn,